Alrighty, so for week 3, I'm going to take what you've learned in Andrew's course, and we're gonna extend that a little bit. And I want you to write functions for the code that you have from last week. Okay, so let me just go through this first. So I want you to learn how to read code. So what I did is I wrote some code that extended my concept from last week by writing several functions. Okay, I'm going to want you to write 2 for your part of this, but for mine, I wrote several. So let me just show you. All right, so I'm going to scroll up to the top here. So I set up some global. And by the way, the idea here is that you want to start minimizing the amount of global variables. And I realized actually I could have completely removed them, but I thought I'm going to leave some just to show the example. But notice I'm just setting up the variables and not assigning, right? So the idea that you're declaring without assigning. And then I have one function, which is set up new client. One function that is calories allowed. One function is calculate calories, calculate actual calories. And actually, I think I'm going to change this now that I'm looking at it to actually calculate budgeted calories, because that's the idea of what my code's doing. So, that's very common that after you write something, you're like, oh, I could have named that better. So in this case, calculate calories, calculate actual calories, and then calculate daily result, right? And this is where we're extending, again, what Andrew did, and I'll show you this in my code. But in addition to that, what I've done here is I've also added a function that displays it on a web page. And I'll show you as we get to this code when I walk through it, what this code is doing. And you're welcome just for this week, if you want, probably starting next week, I'll have you do this. And so the sooner you get used to it, the better. I just set up what I normally would have put on console.log. And actually, I left this in here so you could see it. Where I did in the past, where I did prior is just console log, I just called display on page. And then I had a function that has a message. And in this case, the message is the result of the name from global. And this is template strings. So definitely I want you to use template strings this week, right? And I'm going to call in the template strings, which is something we saw. I'm going to call determine daily result. And I'm going to pass it to variables that I have determined here by calling two other functions and passing in some data. So let me just walk you through, right? So now that you have the idea, let me just walk you through. So set up new client. I have a string with the name, and I have 4 numeric values, right? So in this case, I'm passing 1, 2, 3, 4 parameters into a function that then become client name. Now, if you remember this week, we learned about setting default values. So if I didn't pass something, these would be the default values that would get set. But if they are passed, then whatever that is passed will become breakfast. So in this case, I'm saying name equals client name, because these are things I've set out on the global. Breakfast calorie budget is equal to whatever's passed in for breakfast, because again, each client may have a different calorie, because I'm imagining that there's another part of the code that actually does like an interview with the person and determines what these numbers would be. And then I've set some defaults just in general. So all this is doing, so this is not, you can see this code is not returning anything. It's just setting up these global variables that I have. And you can write functions that don't necessarily return something, that just either set some values or do some other things that your code needs. Okay. So now if I come back down to this, you can see after I set up a new client, passed in the values, then I set up a variable on the global scope that said total budget calories is equal to calculate calories. And this is a function by passing false, false, and false. Okay, so this is that activity level that I had last week. So now I'm going to go over and look at calculate calories. These are my parameters. And as I scroll back up to look at this calculate, sorry, my keyboard is having all kinds of fun today. Calculate calories. what I had passed in for false, false, false on this first one then becomes breakfast active, lunch active, and dinner active. And now what I've done here is I've set in a local variable called breakfast calories, and I've determined that by calling calories allowed, which is this function, and I've passed in breakfast active and the breakfast budget, cal budget. Now that cal budget was set up here, right, when I've set up my client. Okay, so let's, again, I love my keyboard. I love my keyboard, right? Here we go. So now that I've determined all those calories, right? And this, again, as I read this, I'm like, I should have called this calculate budgeted calories, and then I'm going to return those added together, right? So if I scroll down here, I can see that in my call, in my setting up this global variable, the return value is what gets stored here by adding that last line on that return, right? So it's a similar thing here, but all I'm doing on actual calories is just passing in the actual calories that we're taking in. And that one's really simple because all you have to do there is actually just take those values, the actual, and then just add them together and return that value. Okay, and then the next thing you're going to do, and this is where I'm calling determine daily result within the template string, which you can do that. It's totally allowed. Then that is just passing in the budget and the actual, determining result, which is just subtracting them. And then if it's greater than 0, cool, you have a deficit. If not, then you have a surplus, and it just displays those in there. But remember, this is returning. So this is returning a string. And that's here, right? So I'm calling this returning that string, which I had console log before. And now I'm going to show you the new code. So the new code that I wrote, which is display on page, is a function. Again, I'm doing the same thing. I'm passing in the same information. And it will go and run these things. And then what will come back is that message. And that's what will get passed in as a because again, these are parameters and this is an argument. But what happens is this code will run, and what will come back then gets passed as the message. Okay, now I could have broke this out into 2 lines, but I thought there's a reason I want you to see. And there's a tendency when you're looking at this code to just go, I can't understand it, which is why I'm going to show you the next piece. Okay, so by the way, I just did this twice for 2 different clients with different activity levels and then different actuals to test to make sure my logic and my result, which was for me the most important thing. Okay, so now let me walk you through this. So this code right here, one of the things students told me last semester was that when Andrew moves from running Node to running it in the web page, it was such a big leap. And so what I'm doing is I'm just introducing this code, and I'm just going to briefly talk about it. It's a preview of what's to come in our course. So what I'm doing is, again, passing in the message, which is the result of running this. And then I'm going to do document create element, right? So hopefully you guys all have a little HTML. And I'm creating a P, which is a paragraph tag. Okay, so I'm just creating, this is not attached to the web page yet. This is just creating it. And then I say that element text content is equal to message, whatever came in. And then I said let output equal document.getElement by ID. And this is a way to query the DOM. And it's querying for a specific location, which I'm going to show you in a minute what this is pointing to. And then it just says output append child EL. Now, the reason I've done this function this way is because I'm running my code, and I recommend, again, I'm not going to make you do this week. Try next week. We're at least going to attempt to have you implement something like this. Do it this week if you want, totally fine. But I've run my code with 2 different client setups. I want to show both of them in the output. And the way I do that is, again, I call it 2 different messages, and by doing this create and then appending the child, it creates one and then creates the other. Okay, all right, so in order to do that, I had to do this. I had to create an index.html, do it in the same level as the W3. Okay, and this is what you're creating this week. And then what you'll do here is you'll set up a div, and you can totally just take this code the way it is. Div ID equals output. So you have a beginning and ending div, and then you have a script, and the source is going to be the name of the JS file. Now, later on, we'll organize these into a folder and all that. But for today, and you can either put this at the top or at the bottom when you'll learn later why you put it in one. But most of the best practices put this right before the end of body. So script, daily burn, and this just points to the JavaScript. Okay, and when the page loads, then it's going to run this code. So again, the sooner I'm kind of responding to last semester students' comments. Okay, by the way, I showed this here, so let me show it again. One of the nice things about the editor is if you just do a new file, make sure you call it .html. You do exclamation point tab, it'll actually give you that code so you don't have to write it. But it is good, by the way. The more experience you have here, the better. But all you have to have in that directory, again, if you're going to use this, you can use console log this week, but starting next week, like I said, you're going to need to do this. Now that I've explained my code, I want you to learn how to look at code in the browser, because ultimately, because we're learning client side, that's where we're going to end up. Last week, I had told you about running debug in the editor. Do you remember that for Node? And that's great, except ultimately, we're going to not be using Node. We'll be using the browser. So let me show you how to do this here. So what I've done is I've pushed my code to the public, and because I have an HTML now, I'm going to click on this and it's going to open up, and here's the output. That output of my two code blocks that we're setting that I showed you at the bottom. And what I want you to do is this: right click and hit inspect. Okay. Now, what'll happen here is it'll show you just the HTML. What I want you to do is go over to, and by the way, you can also see the console logs that I had running there, and I could remove those as well. But you go to sources, and then you'll see the directory and you'll see the index. But what I want you to do is click on this JavaScript file right here. And you can tell I already did this. When you come into here, it'll look like that, and you just click on it, right? And it'll show the page, or the code. Sorry, the code. So what you want to do here, and you can do this, is go to line 61 and click on it. And what this does is it creates a breakpoint. And I want you to, now that I've gone over it, I want you to go through this code again using this debugger that's built into Chrome, because it's more like what you would use in a long run. And the sooner you learn how to run through code, the more it helps you read code so much easier. So let me show you what I mean. So now that I've set that breakpoint, what I can come up here to do is just hit refresh. Okay. And what it'll do is it'll stop my code right there. Okay. And a lot of information is provided. Nothing has happened yet. Because I haven't hit, it hasn't done the console.log, but if I come over here, I can either step over it, I can step into it, I can step out of it. But really what I want you to do this time is just step, which means just execute the next line. So I'm going to hit this, and now you can see it actually outputted, because here's my console. If you're seeing the what's new, just click on the console. So that's the first line, was just a console.log. And so now it's going to run this function, setup client, passing in these these parameters become arguments. And again, if I step into, you can actually see that. And what's cool here is that it will give you so much information, right? So here is, and by the way, look, it actually shows their local too. Okay, which is kind of cool, because you start to understand this idea of global and local. And right now, if you go down and look at here, there'll be a lot of things in the global, but one of the things, and see if we can find it, will actually be those values, and it may be towards the end. Sometimes it takes a while to see them, because there's so much on the web page. Probably the wrong thing to do is to go down here and look. Yeah, they're not. They're in there somewhere. But the point is that, okay, you can see that these And all I did here, by the way, is I clicked on global, so I could just click back. And so in this case, you can see what was passed in, right? If you scroll over, if you don't see it, you can see that value. And now we can just step through that function, okay? And now, again, this will give you so much. It's such a wonderful visual. This is why I'm doing it this week. Okay. So the thing about this code, and this is where I want to start prepping you for what I want you to do. So one thing is I just want you to walk through my code. And you, again, now that I've run this first one, right? Now that I've done the setup, now I'm going to run the calculate calories, passing in these values, and what it gets returned, right? So let's just show it again. Okay, so that's false, false. It's going to now, and you can see this, right? So if you click into here, you see that this function calls this function. Okay, and this is what's getting passed in, and it's going to, based on my based on the condition, is return a normal calorie because active is false. And so again, I just can't tell you how beneficial it will be to you to do this. Okay, so that's what you need to do for this first part. I want you to walk through my code now that I've told you about it and learn how this tool works. And by the way, starting here forward, if you want to do this, right, you can share something similar, but all you'd have to do is look at my code for how to make, how to update the web page based on what you might normally use for console.log, right? So first part. And so for this part, I want you to tell us how well it helped you understand the code. And also if there's code you don't understand, ask about that in your reply. Now, this is so funny because I do this to myself. I'm just going to tell you as well. It's like I am just, as I'm looking at it, I'm like, I could have wrote this code so much better. That is so normal, okay? So the next thing I want you to do is I want you to look at the code you wrote last week, right? And I want you to create a new directory. You saw how I did this, right? Name it W3, and then write at least 2 functions that extend your code from last week. So not only do I want you to implement 2 functions at least, and this is at least 2 functions. You could write more if you want them. And by the way, it is good to really challenge yourself here, right? So I want you to write at least 2 functions that extend your code from last week. And what extend means is add new functionality, right? And attempt to have your second function use the results of your first function. And that's what I went over. And I could either, again, do it here, right? I could come back here, right? So this is, I'm actually in the perfect example here, right? So I'm actually determining what that calorie budget is. I'm going to step into this. And now I've used that. So I've run this function, passed in these values, and now I'm using the result of that in this function. Okay, so I just want you to start first. That's why we're doing the first part, is to give you the experience of looking at, again, this, my code example is probably a little more than what it is more than what you have to do this week, but I'm hoping that it gives you a better understanding of some of the things we're going to get used to in the future, right? Has been looking at our code in the browser, learning how to walk through that and understand it and see the output. I'm a firm believer, the sooner you know how to do this, the better your code is going to be, because like I said last week, being able to read somebody's code makes you a better, you just understand more and you can write better code. Again, as I say that, I'm like, but I could have written better code. That's okay. That's just normally the process. Okay, so I hope this gives you a fun extending experience. If you have any questions, please let me know. Have a good one.